Hi, my name is Daria, and today I'll be showing you how to use the DaVinci Resolve mini panel to color grade. We're going to begin with the primary grading tools, the trackballs. So these are found at the bottom of the panel, and they correspond to the three luminance ranges that you will have at the bottom of the color wheels palette. So that's the lift, the gamma, and the gain that are responsible for the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights in that order. You can use the rings around the trackballs to affect the master wheels on that palette. So if I start to spin the ring in one direction, I start to darken the shadows of the image, and then in the opposite I start to brighten them. You can use these to set up your tonal range. So in this case I'm looking at my scopes and I am spinning the gain master wheel to the left to brighten up the image while also darkening it. Notice that I don't have to look at the palettes as I'm doing this. I can look directly at the viewer, so I get a really natural feel for what I'm doing with my brightness. And then of course also I can refer to the scopes and move both of the controllers at the same time, which is not something that you can do with a mouse. So already the workflow feels nice and fast and very intuitive. I can then use the trackballs themselves to work on the colors of the image. So of course we use this for creative color grading. We start pushing color dominance into certain ranges of the image. But we can also use this for color correction. So I think I'm seeing a bit of a magenta tint to the image, and I can just go after the gamma trackball and very gently push it in the bottom left corner to introduce just a bit of green and undo that. If you did want to use it for creative grading, then I could just pick a color and maybe push the entire image towards the red-orange range, make it look nice and warm. And I could also go for the highlight range or the gain, introduce a bit of green. And maybe I might decide that I don't really like what I've done here. So in that case, I'm going to reset this value. The reset arrows are controlled with the keys above the trackballs. In the very center you have a key for all, which will reset both the RGB and the luminance. And then you also have RGB on the left and level, which will only reset RGB, but keep the luminance levels that you've made, or vice versa. By resetting levels, you will pop it back to the default setting of the wheels, but keep the relationship between the red, green, and blue channels the same. So I'm going to press RGB above the gain track wheel and reset that. So to the right of these trackballs, I also have my navigation controls. These are absolutely wonderful because they work on multiple levels. At the bottom here I have my previous and next clip controls. So with these I can very easily jump to the next clip that I want to work on, and then of course I've got my previous button. Above that I have frame controls, so it's a much smaller increment. I could go in there and navigate frame by frame. And then above that I also have node navigation controls, and this is absolutely vital when you're trying to produce quick work. You'll notice that when you work with a mouse, you actually have a lot of traveling that you do, right? You work on a palette, then you travel to the node editor, you select a new node, and you go back to the palette. At the same time, you're trying to juggle looking at the viewer and looking at your scopes. By working on the panel, I can very quickly navigate between the nodes and then immediately go back to controlling the primaries wheels and all the other palettes at the top. So it truly is like a shortcut machine and really speeds up your workflow. So I'm going to jump to the beginning of this clip. Notice that I also have playback controls underneath all of these keys. So I can play my clip forward, I can stop it and play it backwards, which is quite handy. And right now my viewer is set to loop, but just above these controls I have a loop toggle switch. So I can disable this and that will play through to the next clip on the timeline. Now, we've covered the three trackballs, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, there's 4 wheels on the color wheels palette. Where's the 4th one? Well, to control that, you will need to toggle the behavior of these trackballs by enabling the offset key. This is found just above the reset keys I'll click on it once, and now the gain wheel has transformed into the offset wheel. And as you may know, offset is responsible for adjusting the entire luminance of the image uniformly. So again, I can use the ring to adjust the brightness and darkness of the image. I might just set it down here to set my black point range. And then I can click on offset again. And now this has transformed back into a gain wheel. So I can brighten the top of the image, but my shadows stay put. So that's quite handy. Also, when I have this toggled to offset mode, the two remaining wheels turn into the temperature and tint controls of the image, which I use quite a lot when I'm performing balancing. So in this case, the image obviously looks a little bit warm. So what I might want to do is just go for the temperature controls. And I happen to know that rotating the wheel to the left is going to cool down the image. So I'm just going to pull it a little bit. I am keeping an eye on my parades, but then going back to the image, and you can see that that's now started to look a bit cooler. I can refer back to the keys on the right-hand side, and I'll see that I also have bypass and disable controls. So bypass refers to the entire pipeline, and disable refers to the node that I currently have selected in the node editor. I can press that to temporarily disable the tonal adjustment that I've just made, and also the temperature adjustment, and compare that to the original and see that I have a much cleaner image. Now while I'm still in offset mode, I can continue rotating the rings, and I'll see that if I go too far, eventually I will start to turn the image very blue, and then if I go in the opposite direction, it'll turn very warm. To reset temperature and tint controls, you can use the same reset keys that you have at the top, and you can press any one of them and they will just act like a uniform reset. With the tint, it's the same thing. I can drag it to the left. Notice that as well as holding onto the rings when I rotate them, I can also just give them a bit of a spin and the image just keeps changing. So it's quite intuitive. I like the feeling. It's very organic. And then once again, reset. There's no labels to indicate in what direction you should be dragging for cold and hot for the temperatures and tint. But the way I remember it is that the warmer colors tend to be to the right. So that's warmer for temperature on the right, and then magenta for the tint. And I'll reset these as well. Together with the offset controls over here, I have a few more toggles. On the right-hand side, I have the viewer, so I can very quickly expand my image to full screen, so I can take a closer look. And what I love about this is that the rest of the controls remain active, which means that I can continue color grading without even seeing my on-screen controls. So I can keep adjusting the shadows, and in this case, I'm setting up the contrast of the image by being a bit more extreme with the luminance ranges. Cool. And then when I'm done, I can toggle the viewer button off and come back to my timeline. I'm now going to navigate to another clip and show you the final toggle control at the top of these track wheels. So that will be the log. If you look at the color wheels palette right now, you can see that by activating the log key, I'm actually toggling between primaries wheels and the log controls. And the difference between them is just in the expanse of the tonal range. The primaries wheels tend to look more organic because they cover a much wider luminance range, whereas the log controls are much more specific for those different tonal ranges. The shadow will genuinely affect only the shadows, and it will not really touch the highlights or the midtones that much. And when you're color grading, this can sometimes be vital because you need almost like secondary grading tools to reach certain areas of the image. So with an image like this, I've got extremely dark shadows, and I think it would be really nice to push them up, but I know that trying to do this in primaries controls, I'm going to see too strong a shift, and I'm not going to leave enough contrast between the midtones and the highlights. So what I'm going to do is make sure I'm still in my primaries wheels, and I'll just use the overall gamma to raise the brightness of the image. And now, to target just those trees and those details in the foreground of the viewer, I can press the log toggle switch, and by targeting the ring on the shadow, you can just drop the luminance on the trees. And I can also use these for secondary color correction. So right now I think the foreground looks really magenta. In that case, I can go for the trackball that refers to the shadow range and drag it away from magenta, which I happen to know is in the top right corner of my color wheel. But in case you don't know, you can always just exit full screen mode, double check that it's there, and then come back and do that. And now I've brought a bit of green into those trees. Once again, I'm going to press disable on the control panel to compare that, and you can see that's a really big shift. So for me, this would be like a primary setup for the image. This is before I even start doing the creative color grade process. This has just been normalized, it's been balanced, and it's good to go. Above the track balls and above all of these key controls, I also have my adjustment controls. So most of these refer to the same controls that you have at the bottom of the color wheels palette. So stuff like contrast, pivot, saturation, hue rotation. In the very left, you have the lift, gamma, and gain luminance knobs. So these will adjust the luminance of those ranges without affecting the saturation of the image. So this is really the equivalent of using the primaries bars and using just the luminance bar versus using the master wheel underneath it. So that's quite handy. So I could adjust those controls, and I can very easily reset to any one of these knobs, but just by clicking on it. So it is a button as well. I'm going to navigate to yet another clip, and I'll use my adjustment controls to set up a bit of contrast. And I can also adjust the pivot, so I'll make sure that the horse's back is not overexposed because it is the brightest part of the image. Still want to balance that. And again, notice how I'm using both tools at the same time, so I'm not relying on, just doing one by eye and having to look at the palette. I can actually just not even look at my hands as I'm doing this and just focus on the viewer. Cool, and then something else I might want to do is increase the saturation in this image. So you do have a saturation control over here, but I almost always prefer to use the color boost because that targets the areas of the image that are naturally low in saturation, so you can just push them up a bit without oversaturating other elements that already had high saturation. So I'm going to drag this up, and I'm really liking the colors that reveals in the mountains in the background. However, I think it's also giving me a bit of a magenta tint in the white point of the image. So especially on the horse, you can see the shadows are a bit pinkish. So again, I'm just going to pop back to these primaries controls. I know that I want to undo a magenta tint, so I'll have to press the offset toggle switch. And I know that's temperature, that's my tint. To the right will make it warmer, so that means I have to rotate it to the left to make it a bit greener and neutralize the image. So I know I talked you through it step by step, but once you get used to these controls, it almost feels instinctive. You immediately start saying, okay, I need to undo the magenta, boom, boom, rotate, done. And then I can turn the toggle switch off. So before we move on from these key controls, I'm also going to cover some of the additional keys that you have above the navigation keys. So here I can very quickly grab a still of the frame that I'm on, and you can see that immediately the still appears in the gallery. Now, I might choose this time to, for the first time in this video, refer back to my mouse and keyboard, so everything I've been doing so far has been on the panel. But the reason why I still keep my keyboard and mouse around is so that I can name my nodes and label my stills. So that's something I'll still need the letters for. So I'll just type in, that's my look. And that's it. Using these same controls, we saw earlier that I was able to enable or disable looping. I also have undo and redo, so that's essentially your Control Z or Command Z controls. And finally, what I like to use this for is enabling play still, so that's wiping the image in the viewer. If I was to navigate to a different clip, I can press play still, and I'm now wiping that still that I just grabbed. Jumping back onto this clip, I can also press the reset button to completely wipe the grade that I had applied. All right, so everything I've covered so far can be found on the micro panel from DaVinci Resolve. But when we look at the mini panel, we also find that there's an entire segment at the top that gives us so many more advanced controls for working with the color page. So at first, we're going to look on the left-hand side. We've got all of these palette controls that allow you to navigate and jump between the palettes of the color page. So just by clicking any one key, you can see that the palettes on the interface react and change. Where do I need to be? On top of that, there's also a lot of additional controls to be found on the screens themselves. You've got these arrows at the very top of the keys that allow you to jump between the different pages of the palettes. So for example, when I've got my primaries controls open, you can see that I've got a lift and a gamma screen that allow me to control the individual channels. But then if I want to get access to my gain and to some of these adjustment controls, then I can just switch between the pages. Whenever you have a palette selected, the amount of pages that it has is represented by these dots underneath the palette name. So in this case, I've got 4 pages to jump between. On top of that, you can also access different modes of the palettes using the keys at the top of the screens. So right now, when I'm on the curves palette, I'm accessing my custom curves, but I can also go for the HSL curves, and their names are visible at the very top of the screens. And then finally, some palettes will also give you additional options or tools controls. So again, when I'm back on the custom curves, I can see that I've got a tools option up here. And when I select that, that gives me the ability to ungang my curves and start to work on certain curves individually. So it's a really versatile set of tools. You can access a lot of elements just from these 2 screens at the top. I'm going to jump to the next clip that I'd like to work on. And I'm just going to do some primary grading, but this time using the curves. So I'm going to lower the lower midtones to darken that range of the image, but then also raise the upper midtones to brighten it. And of course, I'm generating an S-curve, which is how we establish contrast in the image using curves. And again, I don't have to worry about working on the palette. I am just looking at the viewer and getting a feel for the image overall. I might also go down here for a second, maybe increase the color boost just a touch. There we go. Maybe even introduce a bit of a temperature to it, so I will switch offset on and maybe just cool it down a little bit. There we go. And then finally, if I want to apply a look to the image, then I can switch to the tools controls, ungang my channels, and I'm going to isolate one of my color channels and then just introduce more of one color than the other to create a bit of a cross process, a very gentle look. So I'm just going to drag the bottom of the green curve down to push just a little bit of magenta into the shadows, and then also increase the top of the curve to first neutralize it, but then also push a bit of green into it. By the way, resetting the knobs underneath the screens is the same as resetting them here in the adjustment controls. You just press the knob and it bounces back into its default position or default value. When you're working with the curves, you'll also notice that you have quite a few controls here. So these are spread out in 20% increments. So you can work on different ranges at the same time. So I'll go back to this, control it a bit more. And once again, when I'm ready to compare this to the original image, I'm just going to press disable and see the end result. We're going to jump to the first clip that we worked on, and I'll begin by creating a new serial node because I'm going to, again, apply creative changes, but I don't want to work on a node that I used for normalizing and balancing. So to add additional nodes, I'm going to use these keys on the right-hand side. I'm going to press serial in the top left corner, And that just creates a standard corrector node. Now I can take advantage of my node navigation controls, and I can start jumping to the first and the second node. And while I'm on the second, I am going to gang the channels again. I'm going to exit the tool modes, and I'll take advantage of some of the HSL curves that I have. So these operate on pretty much the same level as the custom curves that we had. Let's say the task that we had with this shot is that we had to change the color of the door in the background to change it from blue to, say, green or magenta. First of all, you know what? I'm going to jump to the previous node, and I'm just going to up the overall saturation of the image just to pop the colors a bit more. There we go. And I think overall maybe it's too red, so I'm going to reset my gamma and brighten it up. So I've got a nice neutral starting point. Right? I'll jump to the next node, and to change the color of the door, I am going to use the hue versus hue curve, right? We're targeting the hue so that we can change the hue. That's the naming convention of HSL curves. So I will go for cyan. I think that's the range. And when I start to rotate this, I immediately see the behavior of this hue range down in the HSL curves palette of the color page. But then, of course, I can also just keep an eye on the viewer as I'm working on this. Drag it up to turn the door green. And I think there's like a slightly different shade of blue at the bottom of the door, so I'm also going to just switch to a different knob and drag it upwards to turn it green. Excellent. So that was a really quick, easy adjustment. I'll press disable and I'll see that the door changes quite quickly. While I'm here, maybe another thing I'd like to address about this image is that there's a really strong color tint on the light underneath the door. I think it's far too red, so it's a bit distracting for me. So for that, because I want to change the saturation of an area of luminance, I will go for the Lum versus Sat curve. I'll click on that using the key at the top of the screen. And here I've got these 4 controls. If I was to click on either the shadows or the highlights knob, I am going to essentially create an anchor on my HSL curve, which means that I can now go for the white point and adjust that without adjusting the rest of the curve. So I can drag the white point down, down, down to completely desaturate that luminance range. They're still a little bit more visible under the door, so I'm going to need to expand some of that to the highlight range, and that's really easy to do as well. I can go back to the highlights, drag them a little bit lower, and what's really nice is that because I have this pointer active right now, as you can see in the curves palette, I can use the input luminance knob to just drag it left and right to extend that range. And once again, when I press disable, I can keep an eye on the light coming in from underneath the door, and you can see that that red tint has disappeared and it looks far more neutral. And we've also got that green door now, so 2 pretty strong adjustments done very easily using the panel. Let's keep looking at some more advanced secondary controls and how much you can really accomplish with the panel. I'm going to jump to yet another clip. So we've got this direct-to-camera interview. Something that you do a lot with interviews, especially if you don't have controlled lighting, is that you need to go after people's faces, do a bit of beauty work. Usually you need to brighten them up a bit, especially in her case because she's wearing this big hat, so she's got a pretty strong shadow being cast on her. On top of that, there's a lot of tan tones in the image, so her face kind of disappears in that color scheme. So I'm going to try to just get it to pop a little bit with saturation as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a brand new node. I don't really like to do secondary grading on the first and only node on the pipeline. So once again, I'm going to press serial in the top right corner. I'm also going to label this so I know what the purpose is of this node. Great. I will want to isolate her face. One of the easiest way to do that is just to apply a circular window and do a bit of adjustment to that. So I'll switch over to my window palette. At the very top, you have the full range of presets that you will find on the window palette. And by default, it's set to circle, but that doesn't mean that it's active yet. So I have to actually click on Window On to see the on-screen control. And I really love how this behaves. I can pretty much grab both the knobs and start to navigate the window across the screen. So it's actually quite fun to play with. It's really fast, responds quite well to your adjustments. Now that I've got it over her face, I will also want to adjust the size of that window and also change its aspect ratio because I want to cover both her face and her neck. And now that I've got the aspect, well, I can just reposition the tilt as well, drag it down. And finally, I will probably want to adjust the softness so that that grade does not stand out so much as soon as I start applying it. So we're going to be quite subtle either way. To hide the on-screen controls, I can just move on to a different palette on the panel, and I can now use my trackballs to maybe increase the brightness on her face just a little bit. I can then refer to the contrast on the knobs at the top and maybe darken it. Use the pivot to make her face a little bit lighter. And then also refer back to the color boost to take advantage of her natural skin tones and, you know, bring up the sunlight on her face, bring up like the rosiness in her cheeks. If I was just dragging the trackballs towards orange, I might find that I'm starting to make her look a bit pancakey, a bit flat. So I like to work with what people already have and just enhance that. Great. And when I press disable, I'll now be able to see that change in the viewer. Great. Now, the last remaining task with this is that because she's talking, she's moving around a little bit. On top of that, this is a handheld shot, so I'm just going to play this back. You'll see. What? Let me just disable the audio here so I can hear myself talking. So yeah, once we start playing it back, we'll see that the camera is floating a little bit, and of course she's moving. So I'm going to jump to the beginning of the clip again and go back to my window palette, make sure I'm happy with the sizing. I did notice a little bit of a spill on either side of her, so I'm just going to change the aspect of this window a little bit so that it's less obvious. There we go, I'm pretty happy with that. And now I can switch to the tracker palette, which has got its own key, and then press track forward above the screen. And that took absolutely no time at all. So it works an absolute treat. I do this kind of corrective work all the time, and I find that just circular windows do the job majority of the time. And being able to track people forward in more or less a two-dimensional space is very easy to do, and it's just one click of a button on the panel. Let me, navigate to yet another clip. So this will be number 5. And this time, instead of looking at windows, we'll look at a different secondary corrective tool, and that will be the qualifier. So let's go through more or less an entire grading workflow with this clip. I am going to, first of all, set up the balance of the image. So I'll give it a label. And once again, keeping an eye on the scopes, I'm just dragging down the lift. I'm increasing the gain and the overall brightness of the image. I'm also going to increase the saturation because this video started off in a log gamut color space, so it is a little bit flat. So I'm going to bring it up quite a bit to see those colors. And now I want to work on a very specific element in this image, which is the sky. As you can see, it's quite overcast. I can see a little bit of blue in it, but I want to just bring it back a bit more. So for that, I'll need to first generate a serial node. And I like to break up my secondary grades using the mixer nodes. So I like to keep them as separate layers, essentially. You can generate mixer nodes using the panel. So you've got parallel and layer options. I'll press layer, and immediately I have a layer node and a mixer that they're now both connected to. I'm going to call this sky. There we go. And open up the qualifier palette down here in the palette, in the panel. So right now I've got hue and saturation controls, which are the top 2 bars in the qualifier palette, but I can use the pages to navigate to the luminance range. And because the sky is overexposed, I will want my selection to focus on the lightest areas of the image. So I'll go for the low knob and spin it to the right to just keep cutting out that range of the image. Now, the first evidence that this is working will be in the node thumbnail itself. So if I look in the node editor, you can see that some of that information is starting to disappear. But of course, I will want to see a highlight mode preview of what it is I'm doing in the viewer itself. So I do have highlight controls on the panel up here. So I'll press the key, and now I have a much better idea of my selection. So I'll keep dragging this until I can no longer see the mountain. Excellent. And I can also adjust the softness a little bit to make sure that the edges are not too harsh. If I keep rotating through the different pages, I will also reveal my matte finesse controls. So I could also use the blur radius. And if I had any noise, I can use my clean black and clean white adjustments to essentially control the contrast of the matte finesse. Once I'm finished, I can press the highlight button to go back to my image. And now I'm ready to start grading that range of sky that I've selected. So I will go back to my trackballs. I will need the gain for this because obviously it's like essentially a white point. The first thing I'm going to do whenever I work with overexposed areas is I'm going to use the ring to darken that area of the sky. And then I can use the trackball itself to push a little bit of color into that range. So a bit of sky blue like that. Once I start increasing saturation, it might feel like the foreground is starting to be mismatched. So I'm going to use my node navigation controls to jump back to node number 2. I'll call this my background now that I'm starting to work on it. And I think it'll just be enough to push up the contrast a little bit. Maybe also push up the mid-tone detail so that I'm enhancing areas of the image that have a high level of detail. So it's just going to push a bit more contrast into them. And maybe I'll darken the image a touch as well. Maybe it will work better with a bit of warmth. So once again, I'll toggle the offset and then rotate the left wheel to the right to add a bit of warm temperature to it. Awesome. All right, so even with these advanced structures, I can continue grading this image using standard corrector notes. I can use the navigation controls to jump to my layer mixer, press the serial key, and I am back to grading this as a whole image. So in this case, I might decide to apply a grade. I'm going to make sure I toggle off my offset switch, that I'm back to my lift, gamma, and gain. And now I can maybe push the whole image towards blue. Counteract that in the highlights, get a bit more contrast going. And once again, press disable for just the node, or in this case, bypass for the entire pipeline. All right, so everything that we've covered, you can, of course, perform all of these controls using the keyboard and the mouse. But you'll find that working with the panel is a lot faster. So if you're handling larger volumes of work, it might be worth thinking about working on a panel instead. It could be the difference between a 3-day turnaround on a project versus a 1-day turnaround. You see that there's a lot less traveling with the mouse. Essentially, the only thing I was using it for was labeling. Something else that I still use the mouse for is for generating custom shapes when I'm using Windows, because obviously those points are very specific on the viewer. So when I'm doing rotoscoping, but otherwise I use the panel for everything else. And thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy exploring the other videos on the website.